Hello, everybody. My name is Elliot Job. I am a Master of Arts candidate in Sustainable Energy here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, alongside my co-moderator, Cameron Safronsky. I have a background at the intersection of higher ed and policy program management, and I'm currently the editor-in-chief at the SAIS Journal of Energy and Environmental Policy. My energy policy interests lie at the intersection of human rights, global South energy transitions, and energy security. I am very excited to be co-moderating this session.
All right, and then good evening, I guess, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Cameron Sobronsky, and I am also currently a Master's of Arts candidate in Sustainable Energy here at Hopkins. In addition to my studies, I work as a sustainability reporting manager at Vox Global, and there I focus on energy, climate strategy, and stakeholder engagement. So my work and experience have really centered around how we translate climate ambition into actionable and scalable solutions for the energy sector, particularly across policy and market environments. So with that, I am very glad to be co-moderating today's session with my lovely colleague Elliot, and then will help guide what I'm sure will be a thoughtful and engaging conversation. We'll pass it over to Elliot again.
All right, and forgive me if I sneeze. I am being affected by the seasonal allergies that are destroying all of Washington, D.C. right now. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Mr. Ken Berlin. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, where he leads work on financing and achieving cost-competitive climate solutions. Ken has spent his career at the forefront of climate, energy, and environmental policy. Notably, he served as president and CEO of the Climate Reality Project from 2014 to 2022, where he helped scale the organization into a global network of climate advocates and leaders. For that, he co-founded the Coalition for Green Capital, advancing green banks and innovative financing for clean energy deployment, and spent much of his career as a leading environmental attorney, including chairing the climate and environmental practice at Skadden Arps. He has also advised governments, nonprofits, and businesses on climate strategy and even played a role in national policy, including chairing the Obama campaign's energy and environment team. Something that makes Ken's perspective especially valuable is his ability to connect policy, finance, and implementation, how we actually deliver a clean energy transition at scale. We are very fortunate to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Ken Berlin.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken. So tell us what you're working on right now. We've seen that you've released a transmission report with the Atlantic Council recently. Are you continuing to focus on that or transitioning to other areas of energy that you've got your finger on the pulse of?
Well, I am now working on really two major areas. What really informs the work that I am doing is the understanding that when you look at this transition to clean energy, to really address it and to be successful, you have to deal with three different things. You have to figure out how to scale up programs to a level sufficient to enable us to do the transition in a reasonable amount of time. You have to do it in a way that comes up with solutions that are cost competitive with fossil fuels. Otherwise, you'll start running into trouble with political support. And you have to work on getting the political support for any programs you're working on. And doing that is particularly difficult. We're in a difficult environment now. But in general, you've got to really work to develop at a grassroots level, at a political level, at every level you're working on, support for what you're doing in a context of a lot of opposition to the plans you're working on. So in looking at this, I've been working for the last couple of years on two key areas. One is we've been working, I think something very interesting to Elliot and Cameron is on the area of how do you increase financing of clean energy and nature-based projects in developing countries and emerging economies. That is an incredibly difficult problem in the sense that the International Energy Agency estimates that these countries need to be spending $2.6 trillion a year by 2030 to get the amount of investments they needed to do this transition in a way that enables these countries to reach net zero emissions theoretically by 2050. So 2.6 trillion is a lot of money. A couple of years ago, the investment was about 265 billion. So you were up to $2 trillion short on what you needed to do. And again, when you looked at the landscape, there are almost no programs out there that even have potential to scale up to the level that you need. The World Bank and development banks do a very, very good job in the area they're working on, but they have limitations on how much money they can spend. One is, of course, they do a lot of things aside from climate. So they can't start spending $1 trillion a year on climate and, 50 billion on everything else. But also, to get to $2.6 trillion, it can't just be government money. We need to bring to the developing world massive amounts of private financing. There is enough private financing available. The money is out there to do that. But the question is, how do you get companies to invest in emerging markets? The World Bank and other development banks are pretty conservative. They do a tremendous amount of due diligence on every project. It takes years to do projects with them. They're trying to reform that, but generally their process is not that attractive to private business. So what we've been working on is trying to develop an approach that massively increases private investment in emerging markets and developing countries. And looking at that, we decided there are a whole series of problems we have to deal with. I won't go into all of them because that could take the whole program that we have today. But essentially, we felt that it's critical to deal with risk. It's critical to figure out how to leverage developed country money so that $1 can support more than $1 worth of projects. It's really critical to develop a very, very efficient mechanism that encourages investment in these countries. So we've been working on developing a massive international loan guarantee facility, which we've been calling the Emerging Market Climate Investment Compact. It's very, very large in scale. It's way beyond what anybody else is doing at this stage. We held about 450 meetings on it last year. I went to Brazil 4 times to work on the COP. It's something that scale. It's something that probably has to be financed by developed country governments, but it's very highly leveraged to fund. You've only got to put in enough money to deal with expected losses. So you've only got to put in probably about 10% of the amount of money you need that you're providing guarantees for. We've come up with a very efficient process, and so we're working away on that. But doing a project like that takes years to get it in place. You've got to build up political support from investors. You've got to build up political support from developing countries. You've got to get developed countries to go along. You've got to get environmental groups to like it. Not everybody likes private finance. So it's a complicated multi-year process that we're engaging in, but it's a very satisfying thing to be working on. And making progress, and I can answer any questions about that. On the cost side, we've been working a lot in the United States now on looking at what's holding back investment in renewable energy. We first did a paper on the levelized cost of electricity, a very sophisticated paper that concluded that renewable energy is cheaper to generate than fossil fuel energy. It's cheaper than natural gas. This is without subsidies. It's cheaper than, certainly far cheaper than coal. But the whole process of building a whole new system out and building out new generation and all that is very expensive. It takes a lot of investment. So we've been working on more than anything else on the concept of how do you build out an electric grid system in the most cost-effective way and in the quickest way, because it often takes now 5 to 10 years to build a new electric line. It's caused a huge backlog in projects out there. And so we just published a major paper on that. And again, it's an interesting area. And again, it's my view and our view that really to build this out and get the political support you need, you have to do things that are cost effective. And so we've been trying to figure out how to do that. So those are 2 major things I'm working on now. I did in my career at the Climate Reality Project, spend years working on the grassroots side of this. At Climate Reality, we train people to become what we call climate leaders in 3-day trainings. We trained over 40,000 people when I was there in over 11 countries. So I worked on that. It's also very satisfying, although it's very difficult work and hard work. So I've worked on all those things, but right now I'm doing this policy work primarily in these 2 areas.
Great, thank you so much. So you've clearly done a lot of work in the global governance of energy, global energy finance, and international development in the energy space. In an evolving landscape of increased nationalism and a seeming divergence from international development in the global south, what role do you believe global governance and international non-governmental organizations play in the modern world regarding international development in the energy sector, and how does it compare to the role they've played in the past?
Uh, I think non-governmental organizations, which I've been involved with, play an absolutely critical role for a series of reasons. One is somebody has to do this. I mean, somebody's got to develop these proposals. They've got to put them in place. They've got to build political support for them. When you deal with existing international organizations, they've got terrific people. They're creative, but all of them are within an organization. They've got to deal with the organizational imperatives, what the organization wants to do. A lot of organizations worry that if you propose new things, you're being critical of existing programs out there. So it's very important to figure out how you get these programs started. Some of them can start at the international program level. The World Bank is doing a lot of new reforms. There are a lot of other entities out there that are doing very, very good work in this. But this process is so complex and so much work needs to be done that you need sort of everybody involved who can possibly come up with it. There's a lot of expertise in non-governmental organizations. Um, the biggest problem I think we're facing now is a feeling that, look, this environment is too hard. There's too much nationalism. Nobody's going to do this right now. Let's wait until the politics change. But you can't do that. You've got to start these programs now. They take years to put into place. So I've been advocating very strongly that we have to develop ambitious policies now, even if they're not implemented for a few years, because it takes a few years to do that. And we need to be ready when the politics change, when people feel they've got to go ahead with these programs to put them in place. There's a chance we don't know what the Iran war will do to the national security arguments on renewable energy versus fossil fuel-based energy. There are a lot of things going on. In the long run, I don't think people can avoid climate change. The impacts are too great. So I think the politics will change. We have to be ready. And I think non-governmental organizations play a critical role in pushing people to do things in an interim time period like this. Um, the existing international organizations can come up with very creative ideas too, and they've got to be encouraged to do that. When they do it, they need to be supportive because they need to reach out often beyond their normal constituency to try and get the support they need to do this. I don't know if that's changed much from in the past, but I would say that there have been cycles where clean energy and climate change are much more in the forefront than cycles where they get pushed into the back. Right now, I think we're in a cycle in a very difficult cycle to do this work, but we have to keep going. Um, um, Al Gore always says that failure to address this issue is another form of denial. And so we've really got to work on this right now and move forward on it. And that's what I'm trying to do and we're trying to do.
Thank you. And it totally makes sense that non-governmental organizations can get the ball rolling so that when attention is paid by these governmental entities, it's the framework and background is there to like really get going. So thank you very much. We're going to move on to sort of climate and energy funding questions now. First one, looking back at the Paris Agreement, what would have been necessary to actually meet the funding goals for emerging markets? And where do you see the biggest global disagreements today on which financial tools are the most effective?
Well, I'm not sure it's just a Paris issue because to raise $2.6 trillion requires governments and businesses to be willing to do that. But Paris plays a very critical role in this, and it's playing a very critical role in the project we're working on, because there was an agreement coming out of in the last few years, first, that developed countries will contribute about $100 billion a year in investment in the global south, including private investment from the global north, from developed countries and wealthier countries. That level was finally reached. Now, obviously, 2.6 trillion is needed, so it's only a very small part of it. At COP29 in Baku in 2024, developed countries agreed to up that to $300 billion a year. Since then, though, there have been very few commitments. Last year at the conference in Belém, Brazil, there was an effort to develop a roadmap. How do you get to the $300 billion? And I think that effort was pretty unsuccessful in the step that they have a document called a roadmap, but it's really a laundry list of things that can be done. It's a laundry list of potential projects. It's not a roadmap on when or how they should be implemented. It's not clear whether a lot of them will be put into effect. I don't dislike it because my program's included in it, but it's really not the kind of document we need at this stage to get there. So what we need now is to really figure out what mechanisms exist or can be developed, not exist, what mechanisms can be developed that enable us to get the needed level of investment. And then in the Paris Climate Agreement, the countries there have to really push the idea that we need to get to this level. Developing countries have to tell developed countries we want these kind of programs that are needed to do that, to do this. And then developing countries have to stand up and do it. We're doing our program in the context of the COP because that $200 billion gap right now can, you can use it in a way that works. Our program, we've been talking about a $500 billion 10-year facility. That's $50 billion a year. And if it's leveraged, developed countries have to put up $5 billion a year. And if there are 10 of them, they have to put up 500 million each. That's doable, but it's a lot of money today compared to what people are doing. But in the context of having to increase investment by 200 billion, 5 billion from governments that gets $50 billion of investment is a great investment in this. So that's the way we've been trying to push it. So we're trying to use the COP process to provide the basis for going forward and the things that really need to be done. There are obviously a lot of different ways to increase investment. I think there's pretty good consensus now that coming up with guarantees that we're talking about are really critical to this effort because they can be so leveraged. I think there's consensus now that you need private investment. We're, by the way, doing all our investment in loan facilities. And one nice advantage of that is that the capital can come from developing countries. So they will own the facilities. We're just the lenders to it. And there's some advantage in that. You don't want developed country companies to own everything in the countries. So working on loans is a good way to avoid is to at least to minimize that project. There are projects that need grants. You need to do grants in certain circumstances, and in many circumstances probably. So there are a lot of things that need to be done, but I would argue now that this idea we're working on guarantees is one of the ideas at the forefront on how to increase this investment to the needed level and how to bring in the private investment that's needed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Cameron now.
Fantastic. So this is a really great transition. I know we're talking about private capital, and we know that private capital is often cited as that kind of essential factor to closing this financing gap that we're talking about. And you also talked a little bit about how the primary barriers preventing institutional investors from scaling investments in emerging markets. I think I wanted to double tap and hear a little bit more from you on what financial instruments or de-risking mechanisms have you seen most effectively in mobilizing private investments in these emerging markets?
Well, I think the financial mechanism that's most effective, as I said, is guarantees. And I think there's increasing consensus on that because it can take away the risk for the investors to a very substantial effect. When you take away the risk, you can do things at much lower interest rates. So you can do more projects. And, as an example of how this works is in Brazil right now, the Brazilian government wants to reforest about 12 million hectares of forest in the Amazon. They have companies that can do it. They'll do it with native vegetation, but they have two limitations. One, they have to know they're going to get repaid, so they want guarantees, and they can't get them. So that is a primary limitation on that. And the second is they can't get loans on it where they need the guarantee, so they're putting in 100% capital. So, if you have to put in 100% capital, 100% of your money goes to the project. If you only got to put in 50% capital, your money can go twice as far because the loan covers that. So guarantees can play an important role. There are times when the cost of the interest rate, even with the guarantee, is still too high. You might need mechanisms, grants, working with the guarantees that you can use to lower the interest rates as part of the work you're doing. That can be a very effective way, assuming you get enough grants into the area. And then, of course, there are a lot of other areas that need to be addressed. For example, a country has to have the right internal financial system and right internal regulations. So there's a lot of work that can be done in that area. In our facility, we're talking about taking a few basis points that we would earn in doing a guarantee and turning that over to the country to build up their internal ability to do these projects A lot of other people looking at that. The World Bank does a great job in trying to build up that ability. So it's a combination of things. I can't say guarantees are everything, but we certainly think they'll play an important role. But there are other ways to do this, that work. In fact, it can be a straight loan. I mean, you can just do a straight loan to the country without a guarantee. A government could do a loan. The question is whether that can get to the needed scale. Um, so I would answer it that way.
So a bit off script here, but what you're saying kind of reminded me of something. I'm very interested in what your perspective is on debt for nature swaps, and the feasibility of those and how those are working.
Well, I think they're working well. The question again, a lot of them do need, support by things like guarantees or grants to go with them. Um, I think that's one of the ways that you get investment into nature-based projects in developing country. Nature-based projects are really critical because one, they sequester carbon. Two, if you don't protect forests, you're actually emitting significant amounts of carbon. And it also has great side effects. I mean, for example, to have a healthy ecosystem, you have to have adequate biodiversity. If you start reducing biodiversity, the resilience of forests disappears. So, we argue that there's a very close relationship between climate and nature. You need to stop climate change to protect natural ecosystems and species because it's obviously having a huge impact on that. We need nature working well and nature-based solutions to help climate because of sequestration and the need for climate resilience. And debt for nature swaps are one way to do that effectively. You can also anything that can generate revenue, and some of the things are very controversial. We wrote a very we wrote a paper on forest credit transactions, very critical to the current system. But there are potentially ways to do this that generate revenue and therefore can bring revenue into the country. Um, so I think that's the best way to look at it.
That makes sense. And definitely because debt for nature swaps are a form of blended finance, I'm definitely interested in hearing a little bit more from you on where you feel blended finance itself is falling short, versus where it's delivering results.
Before you
Well,
start,
blended finance.
So
sorry, I just want to quickly jump in. We will have a question and answer section later. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will answer it then.
And I look forward to answering any questions you put in there. Um, so, we're blended finance is critical, but it's mostly been associated with, World Bank and groups like that, and there are limitations on it for the reasons I said on the World Bank. Not that the concept has a problem, but implementing it has been very, very difficult and time consuming and slow. But what I'm talking about is all essentially blended finance. I'm talking about government guarantees. It doesn't have to be, it can be a combination of um, uh, private and government investment, private investment loans, private investment guarantees. But you need to develop blended finance mechanisms because, again, there's arguably not enough capital and lending capability in developing countries to do it alone. You've got to encourage private investment to come in. Blended finance is a good way to do that and to leverage your funds. We would hope as time goes on and as investors understand the risks in developing countries better, they'll be more willing to go into those countries on their own and make major investments. One of the things that holds back investment is not just real risk, but it's perceived risk. If there have not been enough transactions in an area, companies are very reluctant to do it because they can't really analyze what their risk is. It takes a lot of transactions. So as you do more transactions, this should get easier and easier. But I do think blended finance, or at least finance in which governments and private businesses work together in one way or another, is important.
fantastic. And then to kind of move to the more policy side of these things, I'd love to hear from your perspective how critical domestic policy frameworks are in shaping investment flows themselves, and if there are any examples of policies that have really successfully catalyzed clean energy investments that you'd like to bring attention to and discuss.
Well, obviously it differs in every country, but having a functioning domestic financial system obviously makes everything 100 times easier. It brings in investments. It's very hard to get investment without that. It reduces risk very, very substantially. It therefore lowers the cost of projects. Remember, risk raises the cost of project. The more risk perceived, the more expensive it is to do a project because people want higher returns or higher interest rates, whatever they're working on. So a well-functioning system makes a huge difference. Also, a well-functioning system can work quickly. When people know what they're doing, they can make quick decisions. If they don't really know what they're doing, they can become extremely conservative and work very, very slowly to try and understand what's going on. So a well-working system is critical. I'm not sure I can point out specific one policy here or there that makes a difference, other than to say there is an effort to do that. It's also very, very helpful to companies to come up with a climate plan for the country. That's been required in some of the big investment programs that have been set up. It's good to know where a country's going. It's good for people to feel that people have an idea on how they can successfully address this problem. That's just as true in the United States, by the way, but it's true really around the world right now, if that's helpful.
Absolutely. And then for my personal last question, I know that we've talked briefly and referenced COP, and I feel like it's always kind of looming in the back of a lot of these financial conversations. In the last several years, I think it has been felt that each COP kind of promises to be the finance COP. It has its highs, and then there are definitely people of the opinion that it's fallen short. In your opinion, we'd love to hear a little bit more on what you feel the future of the COP conference looks like, and how does this work moving forward, with the US taking a step back?
The COP process has been pretty unsuccessful in bringing out the kind of finance you need, but it's not necessarily a problem with the COP process, because to do this, you need countries of the world to agree on what needs to be done. Um, you technically don't need the United States to do any of this. I mean, you can do all this finance without the United States, but the United States was a positive leader on this. We were hoping China would take over in this COP. It really didn't, in becoming the kind of leader the United States was, even though it's the leading investor in every way in this area. Um, so I think what has to happen is COP, it's got to keep moving along. People have to keep supporting it. They have to keep pushing it. They have to keep trying to come up with ideas until you can finally get the countries of the world to agree on what needs to be done and to make real commitments. I mean, the reason the roadmap that I mentioned is not a real roadmap and it's just a collection of, programs that may not be implemented is it's very hard to get the countries of the world to agree on what they want to do. Um, so, we have 190 countries in it. Obviously, some are more important than others. Um, but so the process has not worked great. But it does bring everybody together. People are looking at it. And I think there'll come a point where you make progress. I mean, for example, the COP has made progress, as an example, on coming up with standards for credit trading programs. They've done a good job on that. They've done a good job on how you measure emissions and things like that. Um, the finances, of course, is the hardest issue because you actually have to put up huge amounts of money. Um, but I think you can eventually succeed in that. And you don't necessarily need the COP to formally approve all this. But you need to get enough nations on the COP side pushing for something so that people agree and start putting programs in place.
Fantastic. Appreciate you elaborating on that. And I think, just because there's so many countries obviously involved in these conversations, I think want to dive a little bit deeper, particularly as it relates to just transition, and equity. So, would love to hear from you on how financing strategies should really account for a just transition in, these developing and emerging economies, and particularly where energy access and kind of economic development, remain, top priorities.
Yeah, I think the World Bank and the development banks do a good job now trying to get just transition into all of the loans they're working and environmental justice and proper environmental reviews into the work they're doing. So any program, I think, has to have a just transition and environmental impact and a environmental justice component to it. In the work we're doing, for example, we would provide guarantees, but our agreement would require will have a set of standards people have to meet on all of these areas, on just transitions, environmental justice, and whatever. It can be very, very difficult to figure out how to do this, and I don't necessarily have all the answers. The hardest thing really is, I think, is public participation in all this stuff. For example, in the Amazon, I think the state of Para came up with a just transition plan. And, they had a couple of dozen local communities in a committee they worked on. They were then sued because there were hundreds of communities that weren't included in it. And, and I don't have an answer yet on how you deal with with that issue, which I think is it's a very difficult one in permitting in the United States also, is how do you deal with public input on just transition issues. So I think you have to look at it. The exact standards, really sort of have to be negotiated. I can't give you a detailed answer to that in a minute, but the important thing is that people make that part of their consideration when they do the deals, and that the developed world listens to the developing world in developing these standards on what they should be, I think.
Great. Thank you, Ken. So clearly, you have demonstrated you have a substantial and exhaustive background on energy markets, energy transition, and energy/climate finance. However, you've also chaired organizations like the American Bird Conservancy and served on the board of other environmental organizations, as well as founded numerous nonprofits and initiatives conserving wildlife advocacy and environmental activism. How does your work in these initiatives inform your work in energy and vice versa? What is your primary driver to do the research work that you do?
Well, I think everything informs your work on energy right now. My initial interest in all this was because I'm a serious birder. I've seen over 7,000 species of birds in my life. I've seen birds in over 70 countries. I've traveled extensively in the tropics. What that means is that I understand what's going on in a lot of the world. I've seen a lot of this firsthand. So when it comes to these nature-based solutions and nature-based problems and problems in the Amazon, I have a lot of firsthand knowledge, which not only helps you come up with the answer, but also, gives you the incentive and, to really work on these. When you see things yourself, it really helps in the work you're doing. And energy, of course, is critical. I mean, the impacts of climate change, which again are one of the things you can see, although it's hard to separate out, impacts when you do this. You need some research to go with it. But climate has a big impact on nature. As I said, nature has a big impact on climate. And, the more you understand these things, the more work you've done in these areas, the better you can come up with ideas. It's very hard to come up with good ideas if you don't know what you're doing. The more experience, and it may sound funny, but a lot of ideas come out of people who don't have a lot of experience. And it helps a lot when you know what you're doing on this. So, I just obviously suggest that people try and get wide range of experience, read widely. I think traveling and seeing things is incredibly helpful. When I was an environmental lawyer, I started off as a litigator, but eventually Skadden did the most business transactions of any firm in the world. So I did environmental due diligence because you pick up liabilities in a deal on hundreds of deals. And in the beginning, now consultants do, but in the beginning, the lawyers did it. So I traveled and saw loads of industrial facilities firsthand and saw what their issues are. And, that kind of thing is very, very helpful. So again, I urge as students that look as widely as you can, think as widely as you can, take diverse courses in this area so you can figure out what's going on, and then try and figure out with what you want to do, what kind of experience you need and where you want to work to get that experience.
Great, thank you. My primary takeaway from that is that I should go on long vacations and enjoy myself. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, I worked at law firms where, you work 80 hours a week when I was younger. It's not quite as hard today. But I always, of course, everybody my age think it's not quite as hard, but it's really the hours are down. But I always took vacations. And when I was running an organization, I always insisted that people take vacations because you can learn when you do that. And you also need the time off. But the two things together can be very, very helpful. So yes, take vacations and have fun.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to move on to sort of a career section. We've got a lot of young professionals and professional programs, as well as master students and students in various areas as part of this talk. So I wanted to ask, for young scholars and professionals looking to make a career transition into sustainability and energy, what are your primary recommendations you have to differentiate and highlight themselves in an increasingly competitive and inaccessible industry?
Well, as I said, I think, you start off with getting as much experience you can, having a broad background in these areas. But I think when you go into an interview, the most important thing you need to do or is A, understand the company you're going to. B, understand what you think you want to do in that company. And then C, confidently talk about you and how you would interact with the program and the kind of work you would do on it. I mean, there's no magic in this, but again, the broader your background, the more confident you sound in the area you are on. You've got to sound enthusiastic in the work you're doing, and you should really only be applying for as much as you can for a job that you're at least somewhat enthusiastic about. You'll certainly enjoy it a lot more if you do that. So it's really a process of um, getting experience, getting yourself ready, understand what you want to do, work in that area as a student. You've gone through a long process of learning and, potentially working in summers and things like that. And, just try and get good experience in doing that is the thing that I recommend the most. And again, when you go into an interview, I have kids, so they've been doing interviews, so I have been giving this advice is, go in and be as confident as you can, but don't be afraid to say your opinion. You may not be right, but the people working on it have all probably been wrong more often than right anyway. So, in the climate area, so you can go ahead and sound confident.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Well, so Cameron and I are going to moderate the question and answer session now. We're going to switch off between questions. And so please pop your questions in the chat and we will go ahead and answer them. So our first question is from Emily. Guarantees are the way to go, but the reality is that governments in developing countries do not have the fiscal space to guarantee projects in the high debt environment. How else can private sector de-risk for institutional clients and attain scale? How else can government provide comfort without the liability?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it has been a major problem in these deals because a lot of the entities that are giving guarantees require a backup country guarantee. The key is to not require that backup country guarantee. The program we have does not require a backup country guarantee to do the deals. Therefore, it adds no cost to the developing country. It does not increase the hit on their balance sheets. If they give a guarantee, they take a hit on their balance sheet. It's a debt that they have to take account. Many countries cannot take on additional debt. The only way to avoid that is not to require the backup country guarantee. And we think, again, I won't go into all the details, but with a proper program, with the proper investors in countries that have a high enough credit rating, we don't need to require that guarantee to get developed countries to invest. In our program, developed countries are taking somewhat of a risk, more than they do in the World Bank context. But again, we've argued that, look, if you're not doing this, you're going to give a 100% loan or 100% grant. And the 100% grant, you don't get anything back. In the loans, your guarantee is there without I'm sorry, the risk is there, same risk is there. So you're better off doing it in the context we're working on. And you do not need, if you do it, we're hoping you don't need, we're hoping countries will do it. We don't know for sure that they will not require backup country guarantees on these deals.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then our next question comes from Lati, and it says, have you seen private investment returns in emerging markets greatly exceed expectations and market projections?
Okay, by the way, before I go to that, for the person who asked the last question, Emily, if you have more questions, you can always contact me directly. I'm happy to help answer that in more detail. I'm sorry, then, can you repeat the question? I was just thinking of that.
Of course. Have you seen private investment returns in emerging markets greatly exceed expectations and market projections?
I don't think so. I don't think they've greatly exceeded expectations. I think we're seeing more of them as countries become more confident. A country like Brazil now has a very good internal set of capital markets, so they can do a lot of work in this area. So you're seeing more projects. The question we get asked a lot is what comes first, the projects or the financing? And the traditional way of thinking about it is you have to have a set of projects and then you finance it. I think the opposite is true. I think when you have the financing in place, you start seeing a tremendous number of projects emerge because it takes a lot of work and cost to develop a project, and people are not going to do it unless they think the financing is there. And if you look at things like our Inflation Reduction Act, here, where there was a huge amount of money putting into these projects, you saw a tremendous increase in projects as soon as the project developers knew that they had the financing capability and support they needed to do the project. So I think there's a way to go in these projects. There are projects being done. Um, it depends on the country you're in. But to get to the level you need a tremendous increase in um, de-risking and the kind of programs we're talking about.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question comes from Jung John, and it's what are there any specific types of projects that look very attractive to private investors?
Yeah, look, the easiest kind of project to do is an energy generation project where you're building an energy generation facility because you can get what they call a power purchase agreement, in which you have buyers agree to buy the energy that comes from that project, and your risk is very, very low because of that. There's no technological competition, um, and the failure rate on those projects is very, very low. In the United States, it's probably less than 1%, and around the world, it's very low too. Um, the projects that are most that are the riskiest are energy are energy technology projects where you're developing a new technology. For example, if you're developing a battery technology, you want to probably 100 companies around the world doing that, and only a few of those companies will ultimately succeed. So those are very, very high risk projects. Things like um, power lines are pretty low risk on the projects you're doing. Um, Nature-based projects are higher risk because there have not been enough of them yet for people to really completely understand the field. And there are risks that can be tough to deal with, like a fire, that make it very, very difficult. So their risk is higher there. But I still think you do those projects with the proper understanding of that. And there's some very good companies doing those projects now. Um, so, so there are projects that are low in risk. There are very important projects, and they'll be the easiest projects, for example, to do a guarantee on.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then I think for our last question that we have, unless anyone else adds any additional ones, how do you see the potential of the carbon credits mechanism in financing domestic climate policies in a few years?
I think there's potential. It's tricky, and depends the kind of project you're working on. We've sort of argued that the best way to do credit projects that deal with a lot of the issues on them is to have jurisdictional wide credits. In other words, you don't do a credit for project A, B, and C. You do a credit if a jurisdiction reduces its emissions. That way, it doesn't really matter what happens on any one project. The jurisdiction has to keep reducing its emissions to get the credit they're working on. Um, the mechanisms now to analyze individual projects are getting to be pretty good. Um, there will be projects that people will go along that people will go along with. They've done a good job in developing the information on that. There'll always be a bit controversial. One big controversy, of course, is whether um, funding credit projects in developing countries and emerging markets is um, that enables developed countries not to reduce their own emissions because they're buying credits instead of reducing their own emissions. However, in nature-based area, the benefits of these projects in developing countries are still very, very large by doing the project, and there'll usually be like the California has I think a lot of places have percentage limits on how much can be credits, so you don't get too much away from developing countries reducing their own emissions.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is from Trent. Can risk be split with syndication, and would this help avoid guarantees on the balance sheet?
Sure, it can be split with syndication. You got to get companies to do it, and the question is, the companies in the syndication are also worried about the risk. Um, so it's it's a complicated question. Obviously, there are projects being done without guarantees. There are a lot of projects being done with guarantees. But I would say even in the United States, there have been, in 2008 and 9, when we had the last financial crisis, the major part of the government program supporting clean energy was a guarantee program. Um, and sort of, if you think about it, at the United States at that stage was still an early stage of all these projects. The guarantees were important. And you sort of at a stage like that in a lot of places around the world. Um, you can, once you do the projects, you can bundle them and securitize them and sell them as a bundle. So the person who did the original transaction doesn't have any more risk in the project. And again, the ability to do that depends on how confident the buyer of the security is that the underlying projects um, will be successful and will pay off the loans or the investments that have been made in that.
Great. And then the last one from Jordan right now takes a little bit of a broader view. We're interested in what should be the balance between investment in domestic climate policy and climate policy in developing countries.
Well, obviously, the gigantic majority of investment in the United States by the United States, even if we have a very pro-climate change regime, is going to be in the United States. And we've got to invest, trillions of dollars in the United States also. Um, but the key is to try and get enough investment outside the United States to enable these countries to enable developing countries and emerging markets to go forward in the work that they're doing. You can try and leverage the money that goes into that as a result of that. But there will be limitations on it. That's why you need private investment to back up governments. Governments are not going to put, developed country governments are not going to put $1 trillion of investment into emerging markets. They're just not going to do it. It's too much money. They need that money for their own projects too. So what you've got to really do is create an environment where their money goes as far as possible, enough private investment comes in to enable this to work successfully.
Thank you very much. I believe Dorothy had a question next.
Yes, I did. And thanks, Ken, Cameron, and Elliot for a fascinating conversation. Ken, you said you had traveled a lot to so many countries, and my question was, in all your travels and research, are there any examples of innovative ways, whether it be technologies or ways that developing economies are financing their energy transition that developed countries can learn from?
Yeah, I think Brazil, for example, is doing a terrific terrific work on the forestry side to develop programs to protect the Amazon and Brazil also has major forests that are called the Atlantic coastal forests, and they've got Cerrado to support it. So it's not just the Amazon, but they've developed programs on how to finance these programs. They do need loan guarantees on some of this, but they do have internal loan guarantee programs also that aren't quite large enough. They're working with um, the development banks to support their programs also. They've come up with an innovative tropical forest forever fund, they call it, to try and finance the work they're doing in these um, uh, in the nature-based area. It's a very complex program. It's very innovative. I'm afraid it might be too complex actually, but it's an innovative program out there. So there are leaders like Brazil that other countries can look to and probably do look to. In Africa, I know the development banks now are trying to come up with new innovative programs that work in those areas. The BRIC countries have just come up with their own loan guarantee facility, in some ways very similar to what we're talking about, to come up with guarantees. So they're also coming up with innovative programs. So there are lots of exciting things happening, all around the world in this area that people can look at. That is discussed a lot at conferences and at the COP um, and by the BRICS. And of course, the Chinese are directly taking their technologies, all around the world now, and they're very innovative and key technologies. They can sometimes put on difficult conditions for the countries. It's not all easy, but um, there is lots of knowledge being developed on how to do these things. Um, and we're getting better at all these things. Nuclear is, and the one thing you have to look at when you look at all these new innovative programs is, are they cost effective? I mean, nuclear will sweep a lot of places in the world as soon as it becomes cost effective. Right now, it's super expensive to do, and it takes super long to build a nuclear plant. Um, Batteries are finally getting to the point where they're becoming very, very cheap, and renewable energy plus batteries becoming cheaper than gas or coal. That's really critical. So again, you've got to look at both how innovative they are, but that's the starting point. The next question is how expensive are they?
Yeah, I do have a follow-up question as well. In terms of the regions right now, when you talk about developing economies like Southeast Asia, Latin America, or Africa, which region would you say is kind of ahead of the times right now? Um, yeah.
Well, that's a good question. Depends what you include in developing countries. Like you include China and India. If you
Yeah.
include China and
Okay.
India,
Yeah.
Asia is
Mhm.
clearly ahead.
Yeah.
They're ahead of the developed world for that matter, if you include China. Um, but it's more. It's not so much just regions. It's really a question of countries, because, for example, the kind of structure we have, we probably need to make investment in countries that get an international investment grade rating. Um, that's a rating that says, they have the right system in place and all the rest of that. So the key is for countries to push themselves to develop their system enough so they start getting investment grade ratings on that. Um, and for example, in the guarantee work, we would have a hard time to a regional bank in Africa or Latin America or Asia because not enough countries there have investment grade ratings. We're better off doing individual countries. So I think what you need is the regions, the investment banks in the region, the regional banks, and others have to work to elevate all the countries in the region to a level where financing becomes easier for them and interest rates start going down.
Thanks for answering my questions, Ken. Over to you, Cameron and Elliot.
Hey, excuse me. Thank you so much, Ken. Can everybody do a little virtual round of applause, please? It's not that much effort and it makes people feel happy. There we go.
No, thank you all very much, and thank you for the good questions. And again, if anybody has any follow-up questions, you can speak to Dorothy or Elliot or Cameron, and they'll put you in touch with me, and I'm happy to answer anything.
Yes, please. You can, I'll put my email in the chat. So if you need anything, you can reach out to me and I will connect you with Ken. Thank you so much, Ken, for this amazing session. It has been an absolute pleasure. We're super excited that we managed to get you despite how busy you are. And we really look forward to engaging with you in the future as part of SAIS.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you all listening, and I hope you all go on to have great and impactful careers in this area.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all again.